The US have now got a reputation for just making stuff up on the fly, so you don't take anything they say seriously.
Well,
You'd be a fool to do
it's not surprising that world leaders think it's a good idea to get together pronto in order to try and do something about this mania that's going on with the US empire. And who better to talk to about what's going on than Press for Truth's Dan Dix, who's joining us on the line now from Washington, D.C. Hi, Dan, can you hear me?
I can, yeah. Thank you for having me, guys. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you. But so can you just give us an idea what the relationship at the moment is like between the Canadians generally and the United States? Because the whole world is looking at America thinking, well, we've got a basket case running the show.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the situation with both countries, really. I mean, up in Canada, we've got Mark Carney, who is no stranger to the Bilderberg Group. The man's been going since, I believe, 2011, and he's been to many, many meetings since then. At one point, even on the steering committee, and now he's Prime Minister of Canada. So this guy, in my view, has been a selection of the Bilderberg Group. I mean, famously, Stephen Harper attended the meeting once in 2003, I believe it was, and 2 years later, this relatively unknown guy becomes Prime Minister of Canada. And now we have a similar situation with this guy, Mark Carney, who has been a very close friend of Bilderberg. Of course, he's a former central banker, bankster, as I like to call them. He was the governor of the Bank of Canada, governor of the Bank of England, and now turned Prime Minister of Canada. And I successfully called that at the 2024 Bilderberg meeting,
well
saying,
done, yeah.
that they're eyeing him as the next Prime Minister of Canada, because I think they need a central bankster because it's very possible that he's going to be used for the next phase of introducing digital CBDCs,
but anyway,
central bank digital
Dan,
currencies.
Yeah, they're very important. And maybe you could just give us, for anyone that's not really familiar, including almost the entire London media with Bilderberg, why is it that can you just describe what is the function of this big get together, and why is it's so interesting that it's 6 weeks early this year?
Sure. Well, this is a meeting for anybody who's not super familiar. We're talking about 120 to 150 people on average, some of the world's most powerful and influential people, presidents and prime ministers and kings and queens and military men and media moguls and leaders of finance who are meeting in secret every single year behind closed doors. There's no minutes of the meeting. There's no audio. There's no video. There's no nothing. The public is not invited. And the reason why this is significant is because the Bilderberg Group are the ones who are often setting up world-shaping events. They famously were the ones who kind of hatched the idea for the European Union. This idea of European countries giving up their national sovereignty, giving up their own currencies, some of them that have been around for thousands of years, and exchanging it for the euro. This was all hatched at Bilderberg. You have, similarly, around the time of 9/11, the idea of getting into the Middle East, and it was at Bilderberg, where, as I like to call them, the inner circle of the inner circle convinced the delegates that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. And then, sure enough, when you have all these heads of media, you have all these war hawks in attendance, they're going to take this information and they're going to send it out like a ripple effect into the minds of the masses. And so this is how they operate. So I think the purpose of it is to not only use their sphere of influence to be able to shape and mold the world in their direction, which, let's be clear, it's towards an eventual one world government. But I don't think everybody who attends Bilderberg is necessarily aware of this agenda. It's not like just because you get invited to the meeting that you are involved in some sort of nefarious plan for a new world order. That's not exactly how this works. As I said, I think it's an inner circle within the inner circle who not only hatches the plan, puts it into the minds of the delegates, who then put it into the minds of the masses, but yeah, they also are recruiting the next up and coming potential influential people who they can pull into their inner circle. So I would almost call it like let's call it like an Illuminati summer training camp where they're scouting for the next inner circle invitee, and they're also using these people's sphere of influence to execute their plans. And again, let's be clear what the plans are. We're talking about a one world government. We're talking about a one world cash system. We're talking about a one world army to police anybody who wants to go against this, and eventually a one world religion. So this is what this meeting is about when you've got 150 to 120 of some of the world's most powerful people meeting in secret.
Yeah, and they're from the NATO countries. It's important. They're not just from any old where. NATO is quite obviously an important transatlantic military alliance, been going since the Second World War. It's now, and I noticed there's one of the delegates actually NATO is spreading its wings. It's moving to the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. It's moving to Asia. So there is one of the representatives from that part of NATO is there too. But look, the timing is everything, and we've had ever since Christmas, we've had Donald Trump doing all this crazy stuff, like talking about taking over Greenland. That's on the agenda when it talks about the Arctic security. But the point really here is that Carney is he's not apparently there, although he was on the unofficial list, so he may be turning up just to do a presentation, so he's not on the official list. But there is a faction within Bilderberg who is seen as the kind of sensible guys in the room in the NATO countries. So if you're in the NATO countries, you're looking at Trump, you're going, oh my God, what's he up to? Surely, actually, Bilderberg is fulfilling quite an important positive role here in countering this idea that Trump seems to want to start a third world war.
Yes, well, that could very well be why this is happening in April. I mean, this is the first time we've seen this meeting happen in April since the Greece meeting in 1993. So there's been nothing like this for 33 years. It's kind of out of the ordinary. It's unprecedented. So it does seem there's something going on. And when you have the Secretary of the Army of the United States and you have the Secretary General of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, meeting here in secret at a time when Trump is in the middle of his epic fury campaign, so to speak, against Iran, it really makes you wonder what they're talking about. Because NATO cannot just invoke Article 5 and go after a country like Iran, because they can only do that when the country attacks one of their member states. And they weren't attacked. Iran didn't attack anybody. It was the United States and Israel who preemptively striked first. So NATO is not in a position to be able to get involved in this conflict in such a way because of that very fact. They're the ones who hit first. So considering that this is all happening now in the midst of this campaign to take down Iran, it begs the question, why is the Secretary General of NATO meeting with these guys right now in the midst of this war? We know they have an agenda to go into the Middle East. We know that they started out with Iraq and then Afghanistan and then, Libya and Syria, Sudan, Iran. Everyone's on the chopping block and has been for quite some time. It's just a matter of how are they going to pull this off and how are they going to get the American people and the people of the world behind this? Because it's not enough anymore to just say that this is some sort of humanitarian mission. I think people are maybe not buying it. I would like to hope to think so anyways. We've heard about the weapons of mass destruction. We've heard about the babies in the incubators. We've heard about all this stuff that has drummed it up for the people to want to get behind these wars. But, now I would like to think that the majority of people are starting to see through these types of lies. And so now maybe they're here to in the midst of this war to kind of come up with some new strategies and some new plans. I mean, one of the agendas, the topics, was the future of warfare. I did a little video report about that, kind of discussing that could kind of tie in with their AI agenda. But you got to consider the fact that there's a lot of heavy tech representation here and military men So it is very interesting timing indeed.
Well, I was very surprised that Peter Thiel wasn't in the final list. He was in the original list. Now, he's a very important figure in Bilderberg. He's also controversial in that he's been recently doing these pronouncements about the end of the world and the Antichrist, which is very curious for somebody to be doing that at such a meeting. But look, you haven't quite answered the question I originally said, because surely the idea here is that Bilderberg, you could almost say thank God for Bilderberg. You've got a maniac in the White House who seems hell-bent on starting a third world war, and at least there are a few sensible people in the room, including the head of MI6, Blaise Metroelli, whose grandfather was a Nazi sympathiser. But the point is that actually it's very important actually in the West that we've got something like the Bilderbergers, and they're coming across in a way as a sort of sensible guys when set against Donald Trump and the Israelis.
Well, that's an interesting standpoint, but I'm personally of the opinion that you don't get to a point of being president of the United States unless the powers that ought not be, as I like to call them, are going to allow that to happen. Now, whether or not to the extent of how much Donald Trump may know that he is being used as a puppet can be debated, certainly. But I think, indeed, this organization is above that kind of a public level. And these are the guys who are pulling the strings. So I'm not really necessarily looking at them as the saviors of the situation. I'm looking at them as the ones potentially pulling the strings behind the scenes.
Well, I do agree with you. I mean, I do agree with you to a certain extent. I think they play both sides. The idea is they want to control both sides of the chessboard. But there is a fact, isn't there, about the Straits of Hormuz being closed. This is a massive and international economic disaster. And so there's a whole bunch of very wealthy, powerful people, maybe Bilderberg represents that faction too, that are saying, well, we've got to do something to open the Straits of Hormuz again. We've got to stop this idiot who's crashing the world economy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, crashing the world economy is a part of the overall agenda, because that's what's exactly going to happen if you're going to want an eventual one world digital currency, a centralized banking digital currency. You're going to have to do away, just like they did with the formation of the European Union. They managed to convince all these countries to give up their sovereignty and their money for a euro. It's going to have to happen on a global scale. So I think the crash of the U.S. dollar, the crash of the petrodollar, the crash of the economy is essentially a part of the plan. And now, whether or not they're going to use Donald Trump as the fall guy, the one to pin the blame on, that can be debated. And how much is he going to actually be involved in the implementation of this can be debated as well. But from what I can tell, this is what the agenda is. This is what the plan is. And again, I don't think necessarily any of these guys are going to be trying to stop it.
Okay, so who is there actually covering it? Have you got the big Canadian media, big American media? I bet you haven't. It's just you and a few other people. I wonder what you guys and girls, whoever's actually over there in Washington covering it, what's your sort of chit-chat in the evening, over supper, over breakfast, this sort of thing?
Yeah, there's really just a handful of the crew this year. It's... let me think. Me and three other guys. It's really just four of us, and we're all different individual independent medias. We have myself. There's Josh Friedman. There's a guy named Frederico from Portugal. This is his fourth Bilderberg. Josh has covered probably 8 or 10 of them. There's another guy, Joseph, who's covered 2 or 3 of these. And this is my 20th year, as a matter of fact, covering Bilderberg. Wow. The first one I did was in 2006. In Ottawa, Canada. So I'm a little bit of the OG here when it comes to the independent media covering this, but certainly there is no mainstream on the outside of this. There's no cameras anywhere. It's really just the four of us. And so, yeah, when we go, inevitably to dinner, we're going to talk about what each other got, because right now I'm in the front. We got another guy on the side. We got 2 others at the back. We like to spread out to kind of work together and to cover every potential angle. And I'm just waiting to hear from them if they're getting any action in the back, and I'm kind of hanging out in the front.
So the Bilderbergers are forced to use the tunnels.
Yeah, and honestly, I think they've also forced to switch up their strategies at the airports, because that in the past has been an excellent place for us to get those face-to-face conversations, those head-on confrontations and interviews with some of the delegates has always been at the airport. But I think in recent years they've kind of caught on to that and are working on other ways of getting them through the airport where they don't have to deal with us. But certainly right here, I mean, they've got these giant green screens, sunscreen type things that you can't really film through. And it wraps around the entire building, and it's pretty much an impenetrable fortress at this point.
Well, listen, you know what that tells me? That tells me that there are people in there that they don't want photographed, and they don't want people to know are in there. Because obviously you can't tell anything just by taking a photograph of somebody through a window about what they're saying. But they don't. There will be people, I can guarantee now, there will be people in that meeting that they would much rather that the journalists didn't know were actually there. Anyway, Dan, have you noticed much over the years difference between the conferences of the Bilderberg that are being held in North America and those in Europe?
Yeah, interestingly, this is something that we were discussing over dinner just the other night, and I was just saying to my fellow colleague here earlier today, is I'm kind of shocked at the level of security and police here in the belly of the beast, Washington, D.C. It's really not that much. I mean, I'm not getting harassed like I do when I'm covering Bilderberg in Europe. I mean, when I was in Germany, it was horrific. I got detained dozens of times. Every 5 feet, I couldn't even walk without a cop demanding my identification and telling me to stop filming. I had the German police try to sue me personally for putting their faces on video. I had to blur it out. At the time, YouTube had a feature where you could blur faces after the fact. So I ended up having to do that. Otherwise, I would have been sued. And interestingly enough, not like here in the West, they would be able to sue me as an individual. Even though they're donning the uniform, they're both public and private at the same time. And they wouldn't be the police suing me. It'd be a private individual suing me, even though he's in a uniform working.
But hang on, these police, Jan, these police will be out in the public space. Surely, you're not in a private space taking pictures of them, are you? In a private house or something?
No. In Germany, I was right out on a public sidewalk. And I'm used to what it's like here in the U.S. and Canada, where it's like, hey, if I'm in a public sidewalk and you're a public servant, I have every right to film you. You cannot even ask for my identification. You can't just demand papers. You need probable cause. You need proof of some sort of a crime being committed. That wasn't the case in Germany. They were able to just, they came into my hotel room in Germany and interrogated me inside my room. I was thrown in jail in Copenhagen, Denmark, covering this thing many years ago just for simply questioning the steering committee. They literally arrested me and threw me in jail. And so now, coming into the belly of the beast, Washington, D.C., I expected something similar just because of the location. But honestly, it's surprisingly low-key here right now. I'm walking around in front of the hotel right now, unmolested. They're not really, nobody's bothering me. And I guess that's because they have a First Amendment here in America. So that's maybe the difference. So that's one thing I've noticed. Very, very significant difference compared to my coverage in Europe.
Okay, so what about this war, this Iran war? What do you think? Can you guess what they'll be talking about in there? Because I don't think we've ever had anything. I mean, you mentioned the weapons of mass destruction, or we did, talking about the illegal invasion of Iraq back in 2003. This time, 2026, we've had an illegal invasion that not only is illegal, it's also totally unprovoked there's no plan. There is actually this. It just seems we're just going to hammer somebody, and then we've actually got no plan for whether it be regime change or to get rid of their so-called nuclear material, and no mention, of course, of the genocide being carried out by the Israelis, our apparent allies, and their 200 nuclear weapons that they've got. So what do you think may be going on in their minds, and has been going on in your mind and Canadians and people's minds about this unprecedented move that Trump has made?
Yeah, it's really tough to say, but just kind of stepping back and taking a look at it all. You see that we're being manipulated into this notion of Iran having these nuclear weapons that they're going to potentially use any day now. And you've got Netanyahu saying that literally for 30 years, going on the record saying they're just weeks away, they're just months away, they're just days away. And that's been happening over and over and over and over and over again. So I really hope that people are kind of not buying it anymore. You had the talk of like the Bashir al-Assad using chemical weapons against his own people. You had the Saddam Hussein thing with weapons of mass destruction. It's like it's getting old, and they wanted Iran for a long time now. Iran has been on the chopping block for a long time. So maybe they're realizing it's time to come up with a new strategy, because honestly, I don't know how many people are buying it. Although, like I said, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think people are really buying this idea that Iran is planning on doing something major. Why would they? If, as far as I know, they haven't attacked another country in 300 years preemptively, just out of nowhere for no reason. It's always been defensive stuff. So, I mean, maybe that's the discussion this particular year is how do we get people behind this war, and to support it all out. And and obviously this is pure speculation, but maybe, false flag attacks, that's their modus operandi, that's their kind of their one-way ticket in how to convince people to be against someone. And if anybody's not familiar with that, any of your listeners, this is a military concept of flying the flag of another country on an attack so that you can blame your political enemies for something that you did. So they very well could be setting up a plan like that. And I don't think this is a discussion that happens in the main room at Bilderberg. Again, I think there's an inner circle within the inner circle. And I think when it comes down to the nitty-gritty details of what they're going to do in Iran, these types of discussions happen with the war hawks and the inner circle at the bar and at the, hanging out in the lounge. And I think that's where some of the real things, major decisions are made at Bilderberg. Yeah, well,
I think it's fascinating looking through, I'm going to pick out one or two of the confirmed participants. One of them is a British guy, apparently, Demis Hassabis, who's a co-founder and chief executive of Google DeepMind. This is the AI branch. We've also got the chief executive of Palantir, funded into his job by Peter Thiel. That's Alex Karp. He's there. So it's basically big business, isn't it? And then you see people like Albert Bourla, chair and chief executive of Pfizer. So it seems to me you've got this almost like big pharma, the military industrial complex, all of the big companies that are making a lot of money, that are consolidating, monopolizing their fields, etc. And they're also using the mass media to bamboozle people like the Pfizer lot into thinking that they're marvelous and stopping people like you and I, information getting out to the public about how dangerous their various products are, whether it's being AI drones killing people or injections, that sort of thing. So you're dealing actually with an enormous kind of the military industrial complex plus all these other industrial complexes with all the people that actually finance it all too. So why is it, do you think, that the press, the mass media just turn the other way?
Well, largely it's because most of the significant ones are on the inside, and they're under what's called Chatham House rules. They're not really allowed to discuss what has been discussed. They can talk briefly about the meeting and things like that nature, but they can't quote anybody. They can't say who said what. And largely there's just been a media blackout, for a number of reasons, because that's part of the agenda. But also today's media is not really doing a good job. They're not aware of these types of, things. So I think there's a bit of it's double-faced. It's a media blackout on purpose because of the sphere of influence that people on the inside here have over the media. And it's also just people failing to do their jobs. And again, this is why we're here. This is precisely why I come time and time again. I think this is my 13th or 14th one I've covered since 2006. And I'm not about to go away anytime soon because somebody has to do it. Yeah. There's literally not a single camera here other than 4 little old independent journalists just trying to, expose some of the world's most powerful and evil people meeting behind closed doors. So, yeah, I hope that changes sometime soon. But, maybe if somebody big enough and significant enough in the media does try to cover it, they realize they would lose their jobs. Interestingly enough, one time when I was covering Bilderberg in Austria, I believe it was, there was a G7 meeting happening, and I was on the inside of the Bilderberg Hotel in Austria during lockdown. And the reason why I managed to get in there during lockdown was because they thought incorrectly that I was a part of the White House press corps who was there to cover the G7. And what they were doing was they were flying these media guys out on a helicopter from the Bilderberg Hotel to the G7 in Munich, I believe it was at the time. And I was up in the cigar room, and I came across some of the heads of the mainstream media who were there. We're talking CNN, MSNBC, and one other one. It was 3 guys. And when we discussed the fact that they are there to cover G7, I said, wait, do you not know what's happening in this very hotel? Like the hotel we are currently in, Bilderberg is meeting here in the next day or two, and you guys are covering the G7 in Munich. Like, are you not aware of what's happening in this hotel? And no, they weren't. They were completely clueless. In fact, some of them were like, what's Bilderberg? And I was just like, wow. They were literally the heads of certain mainstream media outlets who were inside the Bilderberg Hotel during lockdown, and they had no clue that the meeting was even taking place.
Well, it's interesting because Peter Mandelson, who's obviously been met to many of the Bilderberg meetings, he's now been arrested. I'm not sure that he's obviously a friend of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. He is one of the people I knew in the 1990s when I was working in the mass media in London, early 90s, that he was actually going around literally identifying journalists that he didn't like and that his friends didn't like and getting them removed from their jobs. And so we have a media, it seems to me now, that is actually compliant. So not only that, of course, the way he got them removed from their jobs is because of his connections in the City of London, the people who finance the big media organisations. And I don't think the BBC was one of them, no, because that's got its licence fee. What they would do is they contact the general manager of the organisation and say, this journalist here, they're writing things we don't like and we would like you to remove them. So you end up with getting a media which is actually not serving the readers, it's just serving the City of London or Wall Street or the financiers of the press. So it's very important you carrying on. Maybe you could just wind up, Dan, by letting listeners know whereabouts to find you. I'll make sure that this little chat with you is up online and shared later on this evening. But whereabouts can they find your feeds and support your work?
Sure, thank you for that. Right now, pressfortruth.ca is probably the best place to go, and there you can get links to all my channels. I'm on, YouTube and Rumble and BitChute and Odyssey and a whole bunch of platforms like that, 8 or 9 different platforms. But for my most up-to-date coverage of Bilderberg, the best place to go is probably X, my Twitter account, which is Dan Dicks, D-I-C-K-S, Dan Dicks, GPFT. I'm putting, a lot of clips up there first and foremost, and then a little later down the road tonight, I will edit it all together and put it into a YouTube video. But you could also search Press for Truth on YouTube. But again, the best place to go is probably pressfortruth.ca. And if anybody wants to support my efforts, I do have a Go Get Funding campaign for this particular trip here in Washington, D.C. And that's you can find that in the link of any of my socials right now.
Okay, well, it's not quantity, it's quality that counts. Dan Dix, quality. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, guys. Keep up the great work.
Much.
Take care.
Cheers, Dan.